Steve, thank you so much for joining us today. How are things in Baltimore?
Things are great. How about Toronto,
Oh, it's
Jimmy?
just amazing. The weather, it's probably 50, 55 degrees Fahrenheit, so it's amazing. Spring is just around the corner.
Yeah, that's what's happening down here. Spring's kind of starting to break a little bit. You can see a little color on the trees, and some of the spring flowers are actually out.
Yeah, it's a great time of year. So one of the reasons why I enjoy speaking with you is because you don't hold back, and I always enjoy your frank viewpoints. And I want to get your opinion on Canada's new Prime Minister, Mark Carney. And before you answer that, I should let our viewers know that he wasn't elected by the Canadian people. He was essentially appointed by the Liberal Party. Our former Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, he was basically removed from office by his party because he was so disliked. And the Liberals held a leadership race, and Mark Carney was the winner of that race. And within just a few days ago, he was sworn in as the Prime Minister. And I know you're very well acquainted with him as a central banker, so I want to get your views on how he was as a central banker and how do you think he's going to be as a Prime Minister?
Okay, the key thing, and we'll come back to this, as you indicated, Jimmy, in your introduction, he really wasn't elected by the people. He's he's a technocrat and a bureaucrat, and the big issue really is how he will transition from being uh, involved with bureaucratic politics, which he's been at the high end of bureaucratic politics, very successful, by the way, at that. If you just look at his resume and what how he'll function in real politics, that's the real issue. But we're going to talk about his history a little bit and how he was operating as in bureaucratic politics and as a technician and technocrat. But to do that, I think the best thing to do is to set the stage a little bit for what's been going on in Canada. You said Justin Trudeau basically was forced to take the exit door. The Liberal Party, if he would have stayed in, would have completely gone down the tubes, I think. But Trudeau was elected in 2015, and the Liberals are in Canada what we would generally term most places is definitely left of center, and Trudeau was a little further left than the left of center, and I also think that although he's a technocrat, I think fundamentally Carney is left of the left of center. He's basically a leftist. So what did the Liberals give Canada, and what's happened up there? It's not really a very pretty picture. I did the GDP per capita numbers for the United States and Canada, and I set the index at 100 for 2008. So the US is at 100 and Canada is at 100, that index. And today, the US index has climbed up to 125. That's GDP per capita index. And Canada has gone from 100 to 105. But what's interesting is that since Trudeau came in 2015, it's just flatlined. It hasn't gone anyplace. It was 105 when he came in 2015, and it's 105 at the end of this year. So Carney inherits a country that's really gone nowhere. I mean, the Liberals are basically a bridge to nowhere. They've had terrible economic policies. So that's the setting. Now let's talk just a little bit about Carney, Mark Carney. Uh, as I said, as a technocrat, he's had what we would say a fabulous career. I mean, the guy's got a resume that hard to beat. And the thing is, if you really look at his actions and what he's done and what kinds of ideas he embraces, uh, he's he, he's he's a globalist, a leftist globalist that has been drinking that Kool-Aid wherever it is, and tends to jump on every globalist bandwagon and fad that comes along. So things change, but wherever the globalists are, and this is kind of the Sorosian world, that crowd, wherever, whatever the fad happens to be, Carney jumps on it right away, and he's pretty effective in the sense of jumping on things and embracing them. Let's talk about money a little bit, because two of the positions that he had were positions as a central banker, one in the Bank of Canada and then the Bank of England, which is very, very unusual. But as I say, in the world of bureaucratic politics and international globalism, Carney knows the game. There's no question about that. But let's look at the game. In terms of money, when the global financial crisis started in 2008, he did exactly what became very fashionable and actually was pushed by Gordon Brown, the Prime Minister of the UK, and that is, the banks are the problem and bankers are the problem. And the way to fix that is to require them to increase the amount of capital that they have, increase, in short, the capital asset ratio of the banks. Now, that of course was a very bad policy, because what it did is they increased the capital asset ratios that the banks were required to hold. The banks can increase that ratio by doing what? Well, they can issue new shares. That increases the numerator, the capital, so that would increase the ratio. But current existing stockholders don't like to be diluted, so that they tended not to adjust the ratio up by issuing new shares and more equity. They did it by reducing assets, reducing the denominator, and if you reduce the denominator and the numerator stays the same, the capital asset ratio goes up, and the mandate is met. The new regulation is met. But when you do that, what do the banks do? Well, they tend to pull back. They tend to stop loan. They don't renew loans. They increase credit standards and so forth. And as a result, the great financial crisis in Canada and the United States lasted a lot longer than it normally would have, because the banks, which are the elephant in the room, creating most of the money supply, is created when a bank makes a loan. What happens when a bank makes a loan? They loan Jimmy some money, and where does it go? It goes in Jimmy's bank account, and that bank account is counted as part of the money supply. So that's how so-called pen money or fiat money in our world, that's how it's created. And most of it's by commercial banks. So that turned out to be a very bad policy decision. It was embraced, by the way, by almost all the establishment. The only ones who didn't go along were the Chinese. And of course, they didn't suffer very much. They didn't suffer at all, really, during the great financial crisis. So that's one thing. Now, the other thing is that as a central banker at two central banks, it's very clear that Carney has never been schooled in the quantity theory of money. I mean, he never talks about, the money supply being important or the money supply driving the economy. And the quantity theory of money, of course, that's been around since the 16th century, indicates that if we have a big increase in the money supply, what happens? With a lag, asset prices go up, the real economy revs up a little bit, and inflation revs up a little bit. The reverse, if the money supply goes down and is contracting, you have a situation where asset prices will tend to slump, the economy tends to slow down, inflation tends to come down. So that isn't in his playbook at all. So that's another, from my point of view, a big negative. And his performance, if we jump to the Bank of England, by the time it ended up, they had a little inflation problem. so he didn't hit the inflation target and stay on the target. So that was kind of a negative. Now we're getting into the politics more, not bureaucratic inside politics, but the fact that Carney is attracted to, again, whatever the fad is in the international global community, the kind of Soros world, and one of those things, a big thing, climate. Of course, he grabbed onto that. You can see that, by the way. You can see all this in his book called Values. You can see it two places. One, he summarizes. He's not too big on detail. He's kind of short on detail, but you get the big picture. And he also likes to quote heavyweights. He likes to quote people like philosopher Hegel and things like that. So, and also he is articulate and certainly likes to hear his own voice. So those are kind of characteristics. But now let's go down to the climate thing. The climate thing, I would say he was almost fanatical about climate. He would be a climate extremist, really, and spreading fear that if Canada, for example, doesn't go to net zero and stop producing oil and all the natural resources that are abundant in Canada, he basically would have a policy that if he embraced the climate view that he's expressed, the obvious policy would be to basically shut Canada down as a commodity country, which it has been, from day one, more or less. And this gets to an interesting thing. What these globalists do, they like to spread fear, and Carney was big on that. But why do they do it? It's what Hobbes described exactly in Leviathan. You give up private initiative, private responsibility, and the private individual gives up everything to the state, and the state takes care of them. That's Leviathan. And when Hobbes wrote Leviathan, the reason you did that, they scared the hell out of the people, the politicians did, so that they would give up all their private rights, individual rights, and the state would protect them. And that meant in those days, protect them from foreign invaders, this sort of thing. But now it would be to protect us from the damage associated with global warming and that sort of thing. So that's one aspect that was very political. The other one is DEI. He embraces DEI big time, and you can see that in his book Values. He also embraces ESG big time, and that's also included in his book Values. The other thing, when he was in Great Britain, of course, he was very vocal and very anti-Brexit. Now, what's the governor of the central bank, the Bank of England? What's it any of their business to get involved in whether Brexit? But he was very extreme and vocal. He basically said Britain would collapse if they went ahead with Brexit and disengage from the European Union. The other thing he was very vocal about that it turns out I know quite a bit about is COVID. He was very much for total COVID lockdowns and embraced that. He wanted, and there again, he was for taking all individual private rights away and having the state dictate what to do with the lockdowns. Now, as it turns out, I'm happen to be an expert on lockdowns, and Jonas Herbe and Lars Joning and I wrote a book that was published in London, actually, by the Institute for Economic Affairs on lockdowns, where we studied their effect, and I think we have the authoritative work on that. We recently just published a long technical article in the journal Public Choice, which was our latest installment on this. But here's what we found. We found that lockdowns probably were the biggest policy disaster since certainly World War II. So here we have Carney was on board with this thing, big time, big advocate of the worst public policy, the biggest disaster since World War II. Now, why am I saying it's the biggest disaster? What we found after doing our meta-analysis is that, and that meta-analysis, that book's called "Did Lockdowns Work?" You can put a cover of that up on the. I'll give you a scan, and you can put it up on the podcast when you put it out. But what we found for the United States, the lockdown saved on average an average of about 9,000 lives. Little context: in the U.S., the normal flu season, we lose 38,000 people. So the lockdown had a tiny effect on mortality, almost, very, very little. How about Europe? Europe, on average, it saved about 14,000 lives, the lockdowns did in the European countries. The average flu season, 72,000 Europeans die of the flu. So again, a very, very tiny impact of the lockdowns on public health. In other words, the supposed benefit for lockdowns was to reduce mortality rate. And it did very little. And what did it do? Well, it destroyed the economies. It set education way back. It's created all kinds of social problems. And there were many collateral damage effects of people who weren't being taken care of for cancer treatments or operations that they should be having, and they weren't allowed to do so because of the COVID lockdown. So I would say, from the policy point of view, you've got a technocratic activist who's on the left, and the question remains: he's been very, very successful in bureaucratic international politics as well as domestic, but will he be able to handle real politics in Canada? I mean, there's a world of difference between real politics and getting elected and winning in bureaucratic circles or internal politics. I mean, yeah, he got an overwhelming vote of support in the Liberal Party. That was a vote, but that's party politics. That's not national politics. And what's he done? His first move was to do what? To join the warring states in Europe, UK. He went to Paris and London, and joined up with the warmongers. He wants to put Canada in a war with who? The Satan himself, Putin, and Russia. This is a little bit of a joke because it's true all over Europe, by the way. But the Canadian Army, you must be kidding. I mean, there's some police forces around that are more potent than the Canadian military. So I'm not even certain if they have. Do they have any operational ships besides patrol boats? I don't know if they have any subs or destroyers or anything.
Yeah, they do. But once again, it's always secondhand stuff that we're buying off the British.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's true, and this was kind of a snub at Trump. Okay, Trump's an unusual guy. He's got the Canadians all riled up about proposing that they be the 51st state, and he's going to invade and take them over. All this BS, but it has riled the Canadian public up, and I think actually put some wind at the sails of Carney politically. But whether it's wise to get in a big fight with the United States, the Prime Minister of Ontario is in the same battle mode, and I'm not certain this is the right way to go.
I would agree with you 100%. And so you made a lot of comments that I want to dig down further on.
Yeah, but
And
yeah. One thing, just the bottom line. You said I do like to get to the bottom line. Let me get to the bottom line. The bottom line is Carney clearly is going to piss the United States off tremendously, and okay, Trump's pissed the Canadians off. Okay, do you counterpunch and pour more oil on the fire? I don't think that's a very smart move. He might get a lot of support from Europe, but Europe, by the way, and it's the same way with Canada. They want to increase this military presence and go to war with Russia, but the Europeans are bankrupt. They don't have militaries. They have no capacity. It's just not feasible. The only reason there's a war going on in Ukraine is that the U.S. finances it, and the U.S. supplies all the munitions and all the intelligence. How's the Canadian intelligence? It's pretty absurd, actually, from a technical point of view. So, at any rate, that's my little summary. But you might want to follow up with something, Jamie.
yeah, that's you raised a lot of good points there. And the one thing I will say, you mentioned Carney's a globalist. Justin Trudeau was too. He was hyper focused on climate change. Everything he did for, well, everything he didn't do for the Canadian economy is because he was so focused on climate change. And I should remind our viewers, we're only a country of 40 million people. So regardless of what we do here, it has very little impact on the climate throughout the world. Now, the first thing Prime Minister Carney did when he came to power on the very first day, he got rid of the carbon tax. And this carbon tax, it was to reduce carbon emissions. And believe it or not, by eliminating that tax, the price of gas dropped by 17 cents a liter or 10%. So you can imagine that's a step in the right direction, but there's been a lot of commentary that he wants to impose this carbon tax on corporations. And what do you think the corporates are going to do? They're going to pass it on to consumers. So one way or the other, we're all getting screwed. But
yeah, this is an interesting point because he was a big, so as a global technocrat, he was all in on carbon tax. He was a big advocate of the carbon tax, and now you see he's in real politics. And what was the first thing he did? He got rid of the carbon tax,
which is a good move.
But like a technocrat, he got rid of it, threw it out the front door, and looks like he wants to bring it in through the back door.
Do you know what his nickname is?
No.
Carbon Tax Carney.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So you raised a few interesting points about the Canadian economy, and I just want to summarize this for our viewers. And because the Canadian economy has been very weak. You mentioned that GDP per capita, it's been declining for many quarters now. Labor productivity has been declining for years. And all of this has nothing to do with the potential trade wars or tariffs. And I should also highlight in the province of Ontario, which is Canada's largest province, 15 million people. It's also considered the economic or the engine of economic growth for Canada. The unemployment rate is 7.5%, Steve. It's the highest since 2013. So a lot of the issues that we're facing right now has nothing to do with this impending trade war or the talk of tariffs. These problems were already in place, and a lot of it has to do with the federal government, but a lot of the blame has to be placed on the provincial government. Now, if we do enter into a trade war with the U.S., I want to get your opinion on that. What will it mean to the Canadian economy, and what's your view on tariffs?
Well, I think you get a thumbnail sketch of that by looking at what the OECD report on GDP for was 2 days ago. The OECD cut their forecast for Canadian growth in half. It went from about 1.5% per year down to 0.7% forecast for this year, which is essentially no growth. And GDP per capita, since the population is growing, will actually go down, be negative. It'll just keep going. It'll be below that 105 number on the index that I gave you. So that and the big reason for the revision, they made some kind of modest assumption, kind of mild tariffs, not the really hardball tariffs, but so if they were hardball, it would even take it down further. So so that's kind of where we are, and why I think this counterattack that Carney and the Prime Minister of Ontario have mounted against this, shall we say, anti-Trump thing, that is not really wise. I think they're going to shoot themselves in the foot. To make a long story short, the Canadian response has been, I think, inappropriate. They're shooting themselves in the foot, the politicians in Canada. I know it has some local popularity, to shoot back at Trump and so forth, but I don't think it's really very prudent and wise. As far as Trump and his tariffs go, Trump has one premise that drives all of his international thinking, his mercantilist thinking, and that is that the trade deficit the U.S. has had since 1975 is bad. And he thinks it's bad because he's a businessman. And businessmen, if you're in a business, you want to produce a surplus, a profit. You don't want to be in deficit. Deficits are bad for a businessman. Surpluses are good. And so that's the thinking. And there's this fallacy of composition, and that is to take the little thing, the business, and expand it into the big thing, the economy. No, they're two different things. They operate in different ways. And so Trump says that the deficit's bad and it's caused by foreigners. This is wrong. The deficit's not bad in the United States. And the reason why is that it's very easy for us to finance it. Everybody wants to be in dollar denominated assets. So if we run a trade deficit and we consume more than we produce, we have to borrow to finance that. And the capital to do the borrowing, it's foreign capital comes in. But we have the deepest capital market in the world. Everybody wants to be in it. We have the deepest bond market in the world. Everybody wants to be in it. We have the international currency, the U.S. dollar, the old greenback. We haven't talked about the loonie, by the way. That's in the tank, big time. You can give a summary on the loonie. I think is it still at all-time lows, or it's close to it?
Yeah, close to it. It was down 10% in 2024, and I think it's the lowest it's been in 20 years. Like, I can't afford to come see you in Baltimore now because the FX is killing me.
Yeah,
it's like a 50% premium on everything.
Yeah, absolutely, big time. But anyway, back to this trade. Who causes what? The trade balance is always caused by the difference between savings and investment in an economy. And an economy like China or Germany, China or Switzerland in particular, we have savings that are much greater than investment. So we have a savings surplus, and as a result, we have a trade surplus. It's called an identity in economics. It has to be that way. In the United States, we have savings less than investment. We have a savings deficiency in a way, and we have, with that deficiency, a trade deficit. And the question is, well, can you finance it? And the answer is yes. as I explained. So the trade deficit for the U.S. is good. It isn't bad. And it's not caused by foreigners. It's caused domestically because our savings is a lot less than our investment. End of story. So the premise that Trump has that drives all this trade talk and these policies about tariffs are going to somehow reduce the deficit. They won't affect it at all. They might affect where we're receiving the imports that fill the deficit, but the aggregate deficit will remain the same if our savings and investment remain the same. So tariffs are not going to affect anything. Same with exchange rates. If they try to devalue the dollar, it's not going to do much to the overall balance because nothing will be changed in the savings and investment relationship in the U.S. So I'm very much opposed to all of Trump's international economic policies. I'm against sanctions. I'm against tariffs. I'm against quotas. I'm against non-tariff barriers. I'm a free trader. So that's my position. I think Trump in the first instance is wrong, and the reaction to it is a typical beggar thy neighbor policy, where the neighbor reacts. You put the tariff on them, they counter with a tariff, then you ratchet up and counter with another increase, then they back and forth, which is very costly for both economies that are involved.
So you mentioned the Premier of Ontario a couple of times. His name is Doug Ford, and you raised a very valid point, and I just want to expand on it. He first came to power in 2018. He was reelected again in 2022. And he had at that time in 2022, he got a very strong mandate. He was going to rule for another 4 years. But he played one of the oldest tricks in the political book, problem reaction solution, or PRS. It's a common strategy used by politicians. He took this situation, this impending trade war with the US, created a perceived crisis out of it, called a snap election in January. 4 weeks later, he was voted back in, got another mandate, and he did so. Keep this in mind, Steve. It was like all done in a 4 week time span in the middle of winter when we had like 4 feet of snow outside. All right. And one of the lowest turnouts in the province of Ontario, I think it was 45% of the electorate showed up. Okay. But once again, he's trying to create this situation. There's this big problem with Trump, and I got to get reelected so I can stand up against them. No mention of the fact that the unemployment rate in Ontario is 7.5%, the highest since 2013. Anyhow, I just wanted to provide that because you made mention of a couple of times that politicians like to pull these tricks. It's been going on since the beginning of time.
The fear. And the fear is we have a crisis. You get all the public riled up and afraid, and then what happens? You try to con them into number one, supporting you, and probably giving up a lot of their freedoms. And this literally is laid out in Hobbes. He talks about the fear factor. And the COVID lockdown, by the way, where did the fear factor come from? It came from the epidemiological models in Imperial College London, particularly Professor Ferguson's work. And this is all considered the gold standard in this kind of modeling. And his model said that the U.S. would, if they didn't lock down, there'd be 2.2 million deaths. Remember what I told you? We saved 9,000 by locking down. He said we'd save 2.2 million. We saved 9,000. So this was the fear factor. And by the way, Boris Johnson was a prime minister in the UK at the time, and he came out with fantastic numbers about the UK. 500,000 or 550,000. I can't remember exactly the number, but it was a big number for the UK. He came out with that in his epidemiological model, and almost the next day, Boris Johnson hit the panic button and the crisis thing and the fear factor. As I say, these models are just fear machines. But Johnson jumped on the thing, and they locked down, and the result was, as I said, the lockdown saved 14,000. Well, I don't have the British numbers in front of me. I was giving you Europe with 14,000 lives, 72,000 normal flu season deaths. But at any rate, all of this happened. You said that Doug Ford did this all in 4 weeks. The lockdowns occurred much more rapidly than that. This was in days they were locking down everything. Of course, Boris Johnson, as we know, didn't lock himself down or his cabinet.
So that's a very good discussion on Canada, and I think we both assume things don't look good for the Canadian economy. And this, if we do enter into a serious trade war with the U.S., the Canadian economy is in serious trouble. So I want to ask you about the U.S. economy now, because we recently had a Fed meeting, and one of the things that I thought was quite interesting was that they took their growth rates for the U.S. economy down from 2.1% down to 1.7. They also increased their inflation rates from 2.5 to 2.8%. Once again, expected inflation rates for 2025. We have Warren Buffett, one of the greatest investors of all time, selling all his stocks, taking his cash position up to, I think it's close to 30% of his overall portfolio, sitting on $335 billion in cash. He's the single largest holder of U.S. Treasuries. And then we've also seen profit warnings out of a lot of the airlines. And I would argue that this is where we see weakness first. It's where the airlines, Delta, American, Southwest, have all issued profit warnings. Delta had some very interesting comments about business travel. There's so much uncertainty within the U.S. economy. People aren't flying the way they were just a few months ago. What's your view on the U.S. economy? And do you think it goes into a recession sometime in 2024, or sorry,
So
2025?
Starting just with the last thing you mentioned, profits, the consensus on Wall Street has been that profits will grow by about 15% this year. I think they'll grow by maybe around 5. So that consensus will come down very sharply. Now, about the Fed forecast, I agree with the not coming down. It's going to slow down. I don't agree with their inflation forecast, but they never have been able to forecast inflation because they don't believe in the quantity theory of money. They don't think the money supply has anything to do with inflation. So when we had this big rise in inflation in 2020, 21, up kind of middle of 2022, they never caught it. Remember, it was transitory. And they had a lot of hokey reasons for why we had inflation. Remember the supply chain thing and oil prices and all these other ad hoc reasons. So they're terrible at forecasting inflation. I think what is going to happen is that we're going to have a slowdown in real GDP and a continued slowdown in inflation. I think inflation might even come in at target 2% or maybe even a little below sometime during this year. And the reason for that is that the money supply is growing very slowly. It's about 3.9% year over year measured by M2. And Hanke's golden growth rate consistent with hitting a 2% inflation target, 6%. And the stock of money actually is lower today than it was in the summer of 2022. And we've had 4 situations where since 1913, since the Fed was formed, where we've had these contractions in the money supply. And with a lag, you eventually get a recession. So I think we have a slowdown and probably a recession baked in the cake for this year. And what's aggravating it is all of the Trump tariff and trade talk, because that creates what's called regime uncertainty. They think all the rules of the game are going to change with Trump, and that's the regime. They think the regime is going to change, and when you get regime uncertainty, that tends to drag the economy, because businesses and investors, they start hunkering down, as well as consumers. They hunker down too if they get worried and afraid. So, and the best example actually of regime uncertainty, big time, was during the Great Depression and the New Deal with Franklin D. Roosevelt when he was a president. Remember the propaganda gag that happy days are here again? That was their slogan. Well, happy days weren't here, because there was tremendous regime uncertainty, and businesses and investors were scared to death of what they were doing with the New Deal. They were changing subsidies, they were nationalizing things, they were massive new regulations, new government rules, regulations, all this stuff was going on. And investment hunkered down, and businesses hunkered down. And as a result, the best analysis of all this regime uncertainty is that the New Deal actually elongated the Great Depression. It added to it. It didn't subtract. The idea that the New Deal saved us from the Great Depression is absolute rubbish. It made it worse, and it made it hang on for a lot longer. So that is what's on the horizon with Trump, I believe. And it's mainly this tariff thing. And it's very uncertain. It's one thing to say we're going to have a 10% tariff or whatever it happens to be on everybody, and that's it. The book's done. But with Trump, it's 25% one day, and then 0, and then 50, and it's just going all over. You don't know what he's actually going to do, because he threatens a lot. And by the way, the tariff idea, it has nothing to do with, this is a big deal. This is a phony argument of the highest order. He believes trade deficits are bad, and he believes that the tariffs will fix what's bad and close the trade deficit. False. If the savings and investment relationship stays the same in the U.S. and the savings deficiency stays the same, the trade deficit will stay the same. Tariffs won't do anything to solve that or change it.
During the onset of our conversation, you were talking a lot about Europe, and you also mentioned Ukraine. And you have spent a lot of time researching and writing on war finance. And because without money, you can't fight a war. And the only reason why Ukraine has survived as long as they have is because they were being funded by the US and other Western countries. And the Trump administration has said that they will cut off all aid to Ukraine. Do you think the Europeans will step up and fund the war, or will this result
Well,
in
they claim they will, but it's just not feasible. It literally is going to bankrupt those countries to rearm and substitute for what the U.S. would be taking away, which is over half. And this doesn't even count the intelligence and the targeting, the satellite targeting for targets. The Europeans just don't have it. They just can't field an army. I mean, they just don't have the planes, they don't have the tanks, they don't have the drones, they don't have the personnel. And I think that the public is not going to swallow this. If they start ramping up defense expenditures like they claim they are going to, like in Germany, for example, Merz will be the new chancellor, and he's hell bent on going to war with Russia. And I think once the German population sees that to do this, they're going to have huge tax increases, or the welfare expenditures that they now receive will have to be dramatically reduced so they can increase defense. That's a loser's game politically, I think.
And the U.S. has funded billions of dollars toward this war. Do you think they were trying to help the Ukraine and the people of
Oh,
Ukraine, or were they? Was it
I,
just a proxy war against Russia?
I think the U.S. was fighting a proxy war with Russia, and Trump clearly he doesn't want to do that. Now, exactly how he's going to maneuver and so forth, I don't know, but it's a little bit like his ideas about trade, tariffs, mercantilism, and all that. He has a set view on on dealing with Russia, and it's not to go to war with them. That's why he keeps talking about peace all the time. Peace, peace, peace. So his view in the Middle East is different, but in Ukraine and Russia, it's I think pretty fixed.
So you've expressed a lot of concern about what's happening throughout the world in different regions, and also the state of the economies like the U.S. and Europe. So I want to ask you a question about equity valuations before we wrap it up. And we've seen a pullback here in recent weeks, a lot of it having to do with the uncertainty with the Trump administration. The S&P is down 10%, NASDAQ a little bit more, 13%. We have seen a bit of a recovery here in the last couple of days, but I know you have a Hanke bubble detector, so tell us about that, and where do you see the U.S. markets going here?
The bubble detector. A week before the markets broke, I published an article on the bubble detector in Fortune magazine, so you can put that reference up so people can read it if they want to. But the bubble detector actually had reached an all-time high. The last high was right before the dot-com bubble popped. The dot-com bubble popped, as you remember, in 2001. So we were at an all-time high. We were in a bubble. The thing is, the bubble detector does not tell you when it's going to pop or when the air is going to come out. But all you know is you got overpriced market, overvalued market, and an overhyped market. So that's what we had. And then it was over the weekend, the market broke on the Monday opening because Trump made some typical Trump slip of the lip type thing. And he says, "Oh, if the market goes down, I don't care," or something like that. And the new Treasury Secretary in the United States has made a number of comments like that. So with the high valuations and the bubble, some air came out of the thing, and we're technically in a correction mode. And I think coming back to my forecast for based on the quantity theory of money and the fact the economy will slow down, I think these profit forecasts that are being made on Wall Street are just way out of line, and they're starting to adjust them down. By the way, I said the consensus was about 15%. They're already starting to unwind those a little bit. I think 5% is something in line. So just think, going from the consensus in the market, 15% profit rate growth, and what if it comes down to where I think it's going to be 5? That'll be a pretty good adjustment.
And the pullback that we've seen in the last few weeks, do you think this is the beginning of something much greater?
Yes, I think we are in a correction mode, and if we are, you easily can be 15 or 30%, and still be correcting. We're not in the Great Depression where we went from the peak to trough. The market went down 86%. Nothing like that. But again, this regime uncertainty comes into play. So it could end up being quite a serious thing, especially if the trade war heats up, the reciprocal tariffs, beggar thy neighbor thing. If all of those things are still in the picture, because the market participants, I think, are still pretty complacent. not as complacent. They were totally complacent. I think we talked once, and I told you I couldn't believe how complacent everyone was in the market. No one was worried about anything. Now there's talk, worry talk, wringing your hands kind of talk. Talk. Well, maybe I wish I was Warren Buffett with 27% in cash, and I sold all my long ETFs on the market.
Yeah, there's a reason why he's the richest man in the world. So, Steve, I have one more question for you before I let you go. I'm always amazed at your work ethic. You're one of the hardest guys, one of the hardest workers I know. You still teach actively at Johns Hopkins. You do numerous interviews like this one. You're very active on Twitter. Where do you get all your energy from?
I think it's just an old habit. I mean, I grew up in rural Iowa. And you learned how to work. Even when I was a kid, I was working all the time, and I've always done that. I actually in 1990, I had four full-time jobs.
Well, very impressive. So, Steve, once again, I want to thank you for making time and sharing your insights today. I always enjoy these
Great
conversations.
to be with you as usual, Jimmy.
Yeah, thank you. And one more thing before I let you go, maybe you can just let the people know what your Twitter handle is.
Yeah, that Twitter handle is at Steve_Hanke. And we're at, let me just pull it up. We're doing pretty well. Third biggest following of any economist in the world at 787,000. No, just clicked over 788,000.
We got to get you to 1 million.
Absolutely. Everybody's got to, jump on that bandwagon. Speaking of bandwagons, jump on it.
Once again, Steve, thank you.
Thank you. Have a great evening, and I'll see you soon.
Safe travels.